Hey, welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at the End of History podcast and jbshreve.com, where we help believers make sense of the crazy world we live in with intelligent and faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that built those times. Today, we're continuing our deep dive into American history with episode 24 in this series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. We're about to cover the Civil War, but I mentioned in an earlier episode that before we get to those stories, we have to understand the background, the setting, to better understand what actually happened between 1861 to 65 when America went to literal war against itself. Part of that setting, part of that background is the story of the others, those whose stories are often untold by the winners of history. It's the story of those who sacrificed a whole lot in the development of American history, but they also got run over in the race to empire. And so in the last episode, we looked at what became of the others, the American Indians, as the U.S. advanced between the American Revolution and the Civil War. Today, we're going to look specifically at Black Americans, freed and slaves before the Civil War. We want to uncover what life was like for them, how the history was really shaped here. I think you're going to be surprised by a lot of what we discussed today, but it is really important to understand this if we're going to understand what happens during the American Civil War. So that's where we're going today. Just a quick note, and I'm going to throw this out there at the beginning of the next several episodes. This one is probably rated PG-13 here. There will be some stuff we cover that might not be suitable for little ones if you happen to be listening to this while you're driving or something like that. So I'm just putting that out there. And yeah. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the others part 2 in our podcast series, The Empire, a 250-year American story.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So the story of Black Americans before the Civil War really is a history that begins long before the founding of the United States. It stretches across nearly 2.5 centuries, shaping every aspect of the nation's political, economic, and moral development. During these years, we have millions of Africans who were forced across the Atlantic Ocean. Their labor became central to America's prosperity, and a generation of Black Americans, or generations of Black Americans, who built families, churches, traditions, communities, often while living under the constant shadow of bondage. And at the same time, they resisted. They resisted slavery in countless ways, through escape. There were rebellions. There was military service. There was just getting an education was a form of resistance. There was faith and persistent demands that the ideals of liberty had to be extended to all people. That was what the Americans promised anyway. That's what our ideals promised. So this story here is not simply about slavery. It's also about hope. Again and again, Black Americans embraced promises of freedom so interlinked to the early American identity, only to see those promises delayed, betrayed, or just denied. But each time there was disappointment, that they were strengthened. They found strength, a movement that would eventually challenge the situation itself. And by the eve of the Civil War, slavery had become both the foundation of Southern wealth and the greatest contradiction within a nation founded on the declaration that all men are created equal. Caught in between the tension of that contradiction was the Black Americans themselves, all right? So there was slavery in America even before there was African slavery. That's something we should recognize first. They were called indentured servants at the time, and they included white European people who worked as slaves for their masters as they arrived to the New World. Those were the first slaves in the New World. Things started shifting early in the 17th century, though. The commonly recognized beginning of African slavery in English North America occurred in 1619, when approximately 20 captive Africans arrived at the English settlement of Jamestown, Virginia. They had been seized from a Portuguese slave ship. These slaves had been seized, and they were sold to English colonists. And this is the way the historians John Hope Franklin and Alfred A. Moss Jr. describe it in their book, From Slavery to Freedom. They say, Virginians began to see what neighboring islands in the Caribbean had already recognized, namely that blacks couldn't easily escape without being identified, that they could be disciplined, even punished, with impunity since they were not Christians, and that supply was apparently inexhaustible. So the shift from just regular white slavery, indentured servitude, it began to shift pretty quick to black slaves, the African slave trade, there at 1619. Although forms of forced labor already existed, including that indentured servitude, these new arrivals from Africa, they marked the beginning of a system that would gradually evolve into hereditary racial slavery. This is where the idea of things like the 1619 Project comes from, if you're familiar with that. I think I mentioned that earlier in this series. That's a telling of American history that places everything within the framework of the slave system in America. It includes the power structures that maintain that system. I don't go along with that whole idea, that teaching, to be honest, but I think knowing the history is important, particularly the facts of that history. And one of those facts is that this 1619 slavery and the slavery that existed just before the American Civil War, they weren't really the same thing. The slavery of 1619, and for nearly 200 years after, it's obviously not fair, not a just system. It was definitely oppressive. But there was a major shift during the Industrial Revolution with the advance of the cotton plantations in the South. This transition didn't happen overnight. During the 17th century, some African slaves in America gained their freedom. They owned property. They even acquired land. Race alone did not initially determine legal status. But over time, colonial lawmakers, American lawmakers, they deliberately changed the law. All right. During the late 1600s, colonies increasingly declared that African ancestry alone made a person eligible for lifelong enslavement. That was written into law before the Revolution. Children inherited the status of their enslaved mothers, ensuring that slavery would reproduce itself generation after generation. Now, note that this hereditary status came through the mother. One of the reasons for this is that a lot of the times the father was a slave owner, a white slave owner, meaning a white man who violated a black slave girl or woman and then maintained the children as his slaves. That's pretty sick. Quoting again from this book, From Slavery to Freedom, the authors say, from the beginning, the vulnerability of slave women to sexual abuse by masters and male slaves, plus their ability to produce and nurture children, brought a distinctiveness to their experiences as slaves. It's believed that the great orator, the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, he was one of these children. His mother was a slave, his father was a slave owner. These changes that developed through the decades of early America transformed slavery from an economic institution into a racial caste system. Freedom became associated with whiteness, while slavery became increasingly tied to black identity. And the consequences of all of these changes, these cultural shifts, would shape American society for centuries, arguably even up to the present. Before most enslaved Africans ever reached America's shores, they endured one of history's greatest human catastrophes known as the Middle Passage. Now, they were captured through warfare. They were captured through kidnapping, for sale by African kingdoms and traders. Millions of Africans were marched to coastal forts where they waited in prisons known as slave castles. Families were separated. Husbands lost wives. Parents lost children. Languages, cultures, entire communities were shattered before the voyage even began. I've told this story on a prior podcast series when we looked at the history of Africa and the slave trade. The Atlantic crossing itself, from Africa to across the Atlantic, it's just horrific when you read stories about this. Men, women, and children were packed tightly below deck in spaces so cramped that many could scarcely move. Disease on these boats, these ships, it spread rapidly. Dysentery, smallpox, dehydration, malnutrition, all of these killed vast numbers of kidnapped Africans. Violence was constant. Ship crews routinely whipped captives, used iron restraints. They suppressed revolts on the ships with deadly force. Historians estimate that approximately 12.5 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic slave trade, while roughly 10.7 million survived the journey, right? That difference, you see the difference there. Hundreds of thousands died at sea. Others chose suicide rather than bondage. For many survivors, America represented not opportunity, but the beginning of a lifetime, possibly generations of lifetimes of enslavement. So the trauma of the Middle Passage remained deeply embedded in African memory for generations. And although slavery throughout America was brutal, important differences developed between the plantation system of the Caribbean and those of what became the United States. All right, so Caribbean plantations, this is before the Revolutionary War, right up even until the Revolutionary War. On Caribbean plantations, particularly those producing sugar, those were among the deadliest labor systems ever created in history. Sugar cultivation demanded relentless physical labor under tropical conditions. Death rates were so high that plantation owners often found it more profitable to import new enslaved workers rather than to sustain existing families. Many enslaved people died within only a few years of their arrival to these islands, to the Caribbean. American slavery, particularly in the Chesapeake region of Virginia, and that area, before the Cotton Era, it proved somewhat different than what was going on in the Caribbean. Conditions there remained harsh, it remained violent, but enslaved populations there gradually reproduced naturally. It wasn't the same as what was going on in the Caribbean. Plantation owners, they increasingly view enslaved people, this is in America, in the colonies, they increasingly viewed enslaved people not only as laborers, but also as valuable property, capable of producing future generations of enslaved workers. Now, it's gross, it's wrong, but it's better than what was going on in the Caribbean. This difference didn't make American slavery humane, but it did create a system in which slaveholders had powerful financial incentives to maintain the long-term productivity of enslaved families while still exercising nearly complete control over every aspect of their lives. Family separation through sale remained common. Physical punishment remained widespread. Enslaved people possessed virtually no legal rights. And so the result was a system that endured longer than the Caribbean slave societies because it kind of became self-sustaining. Then we get to the American Revolution. The American Revolution introduced ideas that permanently transformed the debate over slavery. When the colonies declared independence in 1776, the American colonies, they justified rebellion by proclaiming that all men possess natural rights and that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed. And these principles resonated deeply among enslaved African Americans, black Americans, all right, who immediately recognized the contradiction between what they were hearing and what they were living, between liberty and between slavery. So thousands sought freedom during the war. The British themselves, they tried to weaponize this fact. The gap between the ideal and the reality of what these people were experiencing. They offered emancipation to enslaved people who escaped Patriot masters and joined the British forces to fight during the American Revolution. I think we touched on this in one of the earlier episodes, but Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775, it encouraged many enslaved Virginians to flee plantations and seek British protections. Thousands accepted the offer, despite enormous risk. At the same time, black Americans also served the Patriot cause. Approximately 5,000 black soldiers fought for American independence, particularly in integrated units from New England. Among the most famous was this guy Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and Native American ancestry. He became one of the first people killed during the Boston Massacre in 1770. His death transformed him into an early martyr for American independence. According to the historians John Hope Franklin and Alfred A. Moss, they write, hardly a military action between 1775 and 1781 was without some black participants. They were at Lexington, Concord, Ticonderoga, Bunker Hill, Long Island, White Plains, Trenton, Princeton, Brandywine, Stillwater, Bemis Heights, Saratoga, Red Bank, Monmouth, Rhode Island, Savannah, Stony Point, Fort Griswold, Utah Springs, and Yorktown. They're everywhere, participating in this fight for American independence. These individuals demonstrated both patriotism and courage while simultaneously exposing the irony of fighting for liberty within a slaveholding society. But they believed they were going to be part of the inheritance of freedom and liberty here. Many Americans during the founding generation believed slavery would just gradually disappear. Several northern states even abolished slavery shortly after independence through gradual emancipation laws. Vermont prohibited slavery entirely in 1777, even before the Constitution. Pennsylvania enacted gradual emancipation in 1780. Massachusetts effectively ended slavery through judicial decisions based on its new Constitution. In 1787, the Northwest Ordinance, it banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, preventing its expansion into much of the future Midwest. Even many Southern leaders expressed an unease about all of this. George Washington privately hoped slavery would eventually disappear, and he arranged for the emancipation of the enslaved people that he legally owned once his wife died. Thomas Jefferson, as we've seen, condemned slavery as morally dangerous even while remaining a lifelong slaveholder. Patrick Henry, a very committed Christian, admitted slavery contradicted revolutionary principles, but he also believed ending it would prove difficult. The Constitutional Convention deliberately avoided using the word slavery in the Constitution. Many delegates assumed the institution would just gradually fade as tobacco agriculture declined. In retrospect, these hopes proved tragically misplaced, of course. And this is one of the lessons of history that are so important for people to understand. Kicking the can down the road for the next generation, for the future to handle, hardly ever works. If positive steps forward are not taken in our own generation and lifetime, our own sphere of influences, then things naturally worsen. This is where spiritual realities, where biblical realities always prove out. This is a fallen and dark world. If light is not managed and promoted, the darkness is only too eager to continue. Now, few inventions altered American history more dramatically than Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793. I remember reading about this in grade school and even in high school, but I didn't realize what a big deal it was. Before this invention, the cotton gin, removing seeds from short staple cotton required exhausting manual labor. The cotton gin made processing vastly more efficient and transformed cotton into America's most profitable agricultural product almost overnight. We've looked at this already in one of the prior episodes. At nearly the same moment that this is happening, though, the Industrial Revolution was accelerating in Britain and later in New England. So textile mills demanded staggering quantities of raw cotton. Southern plantations became the world's primary suppliers. So suddenly, slavery no longer appeared to just be an outdated institution. Instead, it became enormously profitable. Cotton exports exploded. By the 1850s, cotton constituted well over half of all American export earnings. Southern planters accumulated tremendous fortunes, while northern banks, insurance companies, shipping firms, textile manufacturers, they benefited from the expanding cotton economy as well. The phrase "cotton is king," that was proclaimed by a senator from South Carolina. It truly reflected the economic reality. Instead of disappearing, slavery exploded faster than ever before. As cotton spread westward into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, even eastern Oklahoma, an entirely new plantation empire emerged. Native American lands were seized through treaties, through warfare, and forced removal that opened millions of acres for new cotton cultivation. The Trail of Tears, which forced the removal of the Cherokees and other southeastern tribes during the 1830s, became directly connected to the expansion of slave agriculture. And once Native Americans were removed, cotton planters quickly occupied these fertile lands that they left behind. So the domestic slave trade expanded enormously. Because Congress outlawed the international slave trade in 1808, slaveholders increasingly purchased enslaved people from other states, like Virginia and Maryland. So slave traders would march chain groups of men, women, and children hundreds of miles towards the deep South within America. Historians estimate that approximately 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated through this internal slave trade before the Civil War. Families were torn apart with devastating regularity. This is a quote from the book Slavery to Freedom, or From Slavery to Freedom. With the official closing of the African trade in 1808, the domestic trade, this is talking about the U.S., became more profitable. And by 1815, about the time of the great movement of population into the Cotton Kingdom, it had become a major economic activity in the country. The machinery for handling the traffic developed rapidly, and before the very eyes of Americans there emerged an institution that served as a substitute or a supplement for the African trade, which was only slightly less obnoxious in its effects upon the social order. Many business firms that dealt with farm supplies and animals frequently carried a line of slaves. This history book, it notes later on in the same section, it says breeding, talking about Africans or African Americans, black slaves, breeding was so profitable that many slave girls became mothers at 13 or 14 years of age. By the time they were 20, some young women had given birth to as many as 5 children. For enslaved people, sale to the Deep South often represented one of their greatest fears imaginable for them. Really important to understand how the cotton boom in the American South changed not only the economic realities of America, but also the very nature of slavery here. Slavery was an unjust and an oppressive system already. It never should have coexisted with an ideal that all men are created equal. But the Industrial Revolution and King Cotton took it to a whole new level. When we think of the brutalities of the Southern slave system before the Civil War, this is what I'm talking about. And this developed not really with the origin of slavery in America. It developed with the rise of cotton in the Industrial Revolution in America, right? The American South imported the slave system from the Caribbean that they had mastered during the sugar era, when sugar was the primary cash crop of the world. In 1790, there had been around 750,000 black slaves in America. By 1830, there were more than 2 million, and the importing of slaves from Africa had been outlawed in 1808. So think about that. That's how much it's growing internally within the U.S. In the last census before the Civil War, the slave population had grown to nearly 4 million people. And the plantation system became one of the defining institutions of the antebellum, the pre-war, before the Civil War, in the antebellum South. Large plantations often contained hundreds of enslaved workers organized into highly structured labor systems. Overseers supervised daily work while owners sought maximum productivity from sunrise till sunset. Life varied depending upon crop, depending upon location. Rice plantations along the Carolina coast differed from cotton plantations in Mississippi, while tobacco plantations in Virginia developed their own routines. But common features united all of these. Work days were long and physically exhausting. Whippings served as punishment for perceived laziness, resistance, or even attempts to escape. Clothing, food, and housing were generally minimal. You'll read about slaves just sleeping without blankets, little boys, little girls sleeping on the floors without a blanket in the winter. Seems like a minor thing, but it's just such a common assumption to basic human life that you would think people should have, especially if they're producing cotton. If that's what they're doing for a living, they can't have a cotton blanket. Education was discouraged or outlawed because literacy could encourage escape or rebellion. Maintaining slavery required this extensive legal system. Southern colonies and later southern states, they enacted what became known as the slave codes, governing nearly every aspect of enslaved life. Enslaved people couldn't legally own property. They couldn't testify against white citizens. They obviously couldn't vote or travel without permission. Literacy was increasingly prohibited. I came across one of my favorite biographies, maybe ever, while researching for this podcast series. It's the story of Frederick Douglass. It's a newer biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, I think is what it's called. I'll be sure to put it on the reading list at the website. But Douglass, after escaping slavery, he would become one of the most influential voices in the abolition movement as both an orator and a writer. He learned to read from the wife of his slave master. She taught him to read the Bible until the slave master found out about it and scolded her pretty severely. But the lesson stopped, but Douglass kept on. He would sneak around the house at night, and in the early morning, he would try to read passages from the Bible, which was the lesson book that she was using to teach him from. Those passages from the Bible stirred his heart. It drew out a powerful prophetic voice that had been hidden under this warped system of slavery. I love that story. All right. Other slave codes prohibited large gatherings, even if the slaves met for church. White supervision was required. White patrols searched roads at night to capture runaway or potentially runaway slaves. If caught, these slaves could be tortured with beatings or even killed. Again, this is from the book, From Slavery to Freedom by John Hope Franklin and Alfred A. Moss. One of the devices set up to enforce the slave codes and thereby maintain the institution of slavery was the patrol, which has been aptly described as an adaptation of the militia. Counties were usually divided into beats or areas of patrol, and free white men were called upon to serve for a stated period of time, 1, 3, or 6 months. These patrols were to apprehend slaves out of place and return them to their masters or commit them to jail, to visit slave quarters and search for various kinds of weapons that might be used in an uprising, and to visit assemblies of slaves where disorder might develop or where conspiracy might be planned. A corrupted form of the patrol system was the Vigilance Committee, which came into existence during the emergencies created by uprising or rumors of them. At such times, it was not unusual for the committee to disregard all caution and prudence and kill any black whom they encountered in their search. Committees like these frequently ended up engaging in nothing except a lynching party. End of quote. It's weird that this even has to be said, but if you strip away the context of America here, this kind of activity and behavior fits right alongside the stories of the Nazis and the hunt for Jewish people during the Holocaust. This is something that existed and was widely supported culturally across the South in America. Fear was what shaped these laws. Fear was what supported this incredibly oppressive and authoritarian state that operated as the framework behind the facade of the South's aristocracy. In many parts of the deep South, slaves outnumbered whites, which made the white rulers not only insecure, but ironically, even more brutal and oppressive. Now here's an important thing to keep in mind here. Not all white Southerners were slave owners. In fact, most of them weren't. Across the South, about 25% of the white population owned slaves. In the Deep South, that number increased to about half. But the entire white population enforced the slave codes and the system of slavery. This was the Southern aristocracy that people don't get. This is what was going on here. There was a caste system in the South that was very different than that in the North. There was racism in the North. I'm not saying there wasn't. There definitely was. But in the South, there was this class system where the aristocracy, the rich, the elite, the white plantation owners sat at the top. They were what everyone wanted to be. These guys were the ones who would insist so strongly on slavery remaining. Below them, probably there are several layers, but there were non-slave owning whites. These guys were a lot poorer than the elites, but they admired, they revered, they looked up to the elites, to the aristocracy. They helped make the system work, because below this layer were the slaves. And one of the constants of fallen human nature is that so long as I'm not at the bottom, I'm always willing to oppress those at the bottom so I don't end up there. It was these guys who ran the night patrols against the black slaves or on behalf of the white slave owners. This was a system that the Southern culture was bought into here. All right? The greatest threat to this culture was the possibility of slave uprisings. Even if there was relative parity from the population density perspective, if the slaves revolted, the elite were most vulnerable because it was on their plantations that the slaves lived. This culture was terrified of slave revolts. An exaggerated paranoia of these things was used to justify all sorts of terrible policies, terrible methods of oppressing and dehumanizing black people, black slaves. And the slave uprisings were very uncommon. But whenever they did occur, it would terrify the whites of the South and amp up the levels of severe oppression used against other black people. Prior to the Revolutionary War, there was the Stono Rebellion, which was the largest slave uprising in Britain's mainland North American colonies. It was in September 1739 near the Stono River in the colony of South Carolina. Led by an enslaved man known as Jimmy, approximately 20 enslaved Africans broke into a local store, seized guns and ammunition, killed the shopkeepers, and marched south toward Spanish Florida. As they advanced, they carried banners proclaiming liberty and called for other enslaved people to join them. Their goal was to reach Florida, where the Spanish government had promised freedom to enslaved people who escaped from British colonies and agreed to serve the Spanish crown. The rebellion grew to between 60 and 100 participants. Pretty small in the grand scheme of things, but 60 and 100 participants before the colonial militia intercepted this group. And a fierce battle followed, leaving dozens on both sides dead. Many rebels were killed in the fighting, while others were captured and executed. Some managed to escape temporarily, but most were eventually hunted down. Some were even burned alive by their slave masters after this. The Stono Rebellion terrified white slaveholders throughout the South because it demonstrated that enslaved people were willing, they were able to organize armed resistance. So in response, South Carolina passed the Negro Act of 1740, one of the harshest slave codes in colonial America. This law severely restricted the movement, the assembly, education, and economic activities of enslaved people while strengthening the authority of slaveholders. If you remember from an earlier episode, the colony of Georgia was actually established to be a buffer state between the Carolinas and Florida. It was feared that escaped slaves hiding out in the swamps of Florida would work to stir up a revolt among the slaves of the southern colonies. Even after independence, again, recalling this from an earlier episode, you kind of learn the background of the stories that were told there. When Andrew Jackson invaded Florida to seize it from the Spanish, he went after American Indians living there in those lands. And he also went after some of these famous runaway slave settlements who made their homes in the swamplands of Florida. The idea of slave uprisings was the boogeyman for the Southern aristocracy. They interpreted everything related to domestic and international policy with this very fear in their mind. In another earlier episode, I mentioned how there was a surge of revolutions throughout the Western Hemisphere in the 19th century. A lot of the Central and South American states and nations, they followed America's lead to break from the European powers. America recognized most of these revolutions, but there was one exception. That exception was Haiti. The Haitian Revolution, which lasted for about 13 years between 1791 and 1804, it was the only successful large-scale slave revolt in history to produce an independent nation. It began in the French colony of what was called Saint-Domingue. Enslaved Africans rose up against one of the wealthiest plantation economies in the world. The rebels defeated French, Spanish, and British armies. And in 1804, they declared the independent nation of Haiti, permanently ending French colonial rule. For slaveholding Americans, especially in the South, this revolution was a nightmare come to life. Newspapers carried reports of plantations in flames, white planters fleeing for their lives, enslaved people taking up arms against their masters. Whether exaggerated or accurate, these stories spread fear that a similar uprising might erupt in a state like South Carolina or Virginia, where enslaved people often outnumbered the white population in many of these districts. Southern legislatures responded by tightening slave codes, restricting the movement of free black people, and increasing more patrols to prevent rebellion. This revolution in Haiti had also created a political dilemma for the United States. Although America had itself been born from a revolution, recognizing Haiti would have meant acknowledging a republic formed and founded by formerly enslaved people who had overthrown their masters. Southern politicians feared that diplomatic recognition would legitimize slave revolts and encourage resistance throughout the South. So as a result, the U.S. refused to recognize Haiti's independence until 1862, when Abraham Lincoln was president. Thomas Jefferson was president when this actually all finished up, when Haiti was born. That's how long it took. And it didn't get recognized until after Southern states had seceded and no longer influenced federal policy. Right? Even after recognition, though, Haiti remained politically and economically isolated. France demanded a massive financial indemnity in exchange for recognizing Haitian independence, forcing Haiti into decades of crushing debt. The United States even later occupied Haiti from 1915 to 1934, leaving behind a complicated legacy of intervention and resentment. Throughout the 20th century, political instability, dictatorship, foreign interference, and recurring natural disasters further strained that country's development. So as a result, relations between the U.S. and Haiti have often been weirdly marked by suspicion, migration crises, humanitarian intervention, and economic dependence. The fears first awakened by the Haitian Revolution have long since disappeared, but the political and economic consequences of that extraordinary slave uprising continue to shape the relationship between these two nations more than 2 centuries later. Now, I would encourage you, if you want to dig deeper into that story, I did do a podcast a few years back on the history of Haiti. You can just find it at theendofhistory.net. It's out there. And of course, there was also Nat Turner's Rebellion, which arrived at the heart of the era when cotton was becoming king in the South. Nat Turner's Rebellion was one of the most terrifying events in the history of the slaveholding South. It began in Southampton County, Virginia, August 21st, 1831, when Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher who believed he had been chosen by God for a divine mission, he led a small group of enslaved men in an armed uprising. He moved from plantation to plantation, and Turner and his followers killed approximately 60 white men, women, and children before local militia managed to suppress the revolt. Turner escaped capture for several weeks, but was eventually found, tried, and executed. To white Southerners, this rebellion seemed to confirm their deepest fear, that the enslaved population might rise against them without warning. Keep this story in mind when we get to the next episode of John Brown's Raid. Slaveholders lived among people whom they controlled through violence, but they were vastly outnumbered whites in a lot of the areas of the South. Turner's Rebellion shattered the comforting claim that enslaved people were content or naturally submissive, was the myths that had been created. The violence here revealed that anger, resistance, and the desire for freedom remained alive beneath the surface of plantation society. The white response was immediate. It was brutal. Militias and armed mobs swept through the countryside, killing many black people who had no connection to Nat Turner's revolt. Some were beaten, some were tortured or executed without trial. The rebellion also produced a new wave of restrictive laws throughout the South. Virginia and other states tightened controls on black religious meetings, tightened controls on black travel and education, public assembly. Teaching enslaved people to read became increasingly dangerous or illegal because slaveholders feared that literacy encouraged communication and rebellion. Black preachers were closely watched, and independent worship was often prohibited. Rather than causing Southerners to just question slavery itself, Turner's Rebellion hardened their commitment to it. Slaveholders feared, or they responded to fear with greater surveillance. Right? They're going to watch them more, tighten down, clamp down. They gave the slaves of the South more violence, more oppression. And this uprising really demonstrated both the instability of slavery and the lengths to which the South would go to preserve it. These uprisings and revolts weren't happening very often. Keep that in mind. But this wasn't a frequent thing. But when they did happen, once in a generation or so, they justified the paranoid fears of the white slave owners and fueled the inhumane treatment of the slaves even more. Slaveholders understood that slavery rested ultimately upon force. Every restriction reflected anxiety that resistance might grow into widespread revolt. As the oppression grew, slaves found other ways to resist, largely through escape. Thousands escaped slavery during this time period. The Underground Railroad emerged as an informal network of slave houses, of churches, of abolitionists, and free black communities that helped fugitives reach northern states and Canada. The Underground Railroad was this informal network of secret routes and safe houses, churches, courageous individuals who helped enslaved people escape from the South to free states, and in many cases to Canada. Despite its name, it wasn't an actual railroad, but a loosely organized movement that relied on secrecy and trust and extraordinary personal sacrifice in some instances. Those who guided escaping slaves were often called conductors, while the homes that sheltered them were known as stations. The Underground Railroad became one of the most visible expressions of the growing abolitionist movement. Abolitionists believed slavery was both a moral evil and a contradiction of America's founding ideals of liberty and equality. Many were willing to risk imprisonment, financial ruin, or violent retaliation to help enslaved people gain their freedom. Figures like Harriet Tubman became legendary for repeatedly returning to the South, going back to the South to guide dozens of men, women and children to safety. The success of the Underground Railroad really intensified sectional tensions, right? And I'm talking about geographic, political sections of the country. Southern slaveholders viewed it as theft of valuable property, demanded stronger federal enforcement of fugitive slave laws. Northerners increasingly saw firsthand the human cost of slavery. The Underground Railroad, therefore, did more than rescue thousands of enslaved people. It became a powerful symbol of Christian conviction, of civil disobedience, and the growing national movement to abolish slavery altogether. One of the chiefs in the growing abolition movement was Sojourner Truth. She was easily one of the most remarkable voices for justice in 19th century America. She was born into slavery in New York as Isabella Baumfree. She spent her early years enduring harsh treatment, separation from family members, and repeated abuse. After New York gradually abolished the slavery there, she escaped with her infant daughter in 1826. And later, she won this groundbreaking court case to recover her young son after he had been illegally sold into slavery in the South. It's one of the first instances in American history of a black woman successfully suing a white man in court. I don't know why this movie hasn't been made, or if it's been made, it hasn't been made right yet. In 1843, believing God had called her to a new mission, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth, and she traveled throughout the North as an itinerant preacher. She became this powerful advocate for abolition, for women's rights, and for Christian faith. Although she couldn't read or write, her commanding presence, her sharp wit, her deep biblical knowledge made her one of the era's most compelling public speakers. Her most famous address, commonly known as Ain't I a Woman, delivered in 1851, challenged both racial prejudice and discrimination against women by exposing the hypocrisy of denying black women the dignity and rights afforded to others. During the Civil War, she recruited black soldiers for the Union Army and worked tirelessly to improve conditions for formerly enslaved people. After the war, she campaigned for land grants, for economic opportunities for freedmen, believing that the true freedom in America required more than just legal emancipation. Sojourner Truth's influence extended far beyond her own lifetime. She demonstrated that courage, faith, moral conviction could actually overcome enormous obstacles. Her life embodied the ideals of both the abolitionist movement and the struggle for equal rights, making her one of the most influential reformers in American history. Now, in an effort to not make this overly simplistic, we should note that not every black American lived in slavery. By 1860, there were nearly 500,000 free black people living in the United States. Some had purchased their freedom. Others had been emancipated by owners. There were others who descended from families that had long been free. But this freedom remained fragile. Although the northern states gradually abolished slavery during the decades following the American Revolution, freedom didn't mean equality for black Americans. Before the Civil War, free black people throughout the North encountered widespread racism, legal discrimination, and social exclusion. Many white Northerners opposed slavery while still believing that black people shouldn't enjoy the same civil or political rights as white people did. In many northern states, black men were denied the right to vote through property requirements or outright just simple racial restrictions. Public schools were segregated. Many churches, theaters, hotels, and public transportation systems either excluded black patrons or forced them into separate accommodations. Employment opportunities were really limited, with most free black workers confined to low-paying jobs like laborers, servants, dock workers, or domestic employees, regardless of their education or abilities. Violence also remained a constant threat. Anti-black riots erupted in cities like New York, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and it was here white mobs would attack black neighborhoods, destroying homes and churches and intimidating residents. Competition for jobs and long-standing racial prejudice often fueled these attacks. Even in states that had abolished slavery, many white citizens opposed the migration of free blacks into their communities. In his book, The Fiery Trial, the historian Eric Foner, he notes how these new states like in the West, like Illinois and Indiana, they passed laws that refused to allow free black people to live there. They weren't slave states. These were just racist states, all right? And keep in mind also, this is the land of Lincoln here. This is where Abraham Lincoln was growing up at. under these laws. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which we're going to look at a little more in the next episode, made these conditions even more dangerous. This new law required citizens and local officials in free states to assist in the capture of escaped slaves and denied alleged fugitives from having any basic legal protection. So as a result, free black people sometimes lived in fear of being kidnapped by slave catchers who could falsely claim they were escaped slaves and transport them back into bondage for the first time. By the 1850s, slavery had become far more entrenched than America's founders had ever imagined it would be. Rather than disappearing, it had expanded across millions of acres. Cotton wealth transformed Southern politics and economies. Enslaved people represented one of the nation's largest financial assets, and with this combined market value exceeding that of the country's railroads, factories, and banks combined. That's what the black slavery represented. That's why it wasn't going away anytime soon. At the same time, black Americans continued building institutions that sustain hope. Churches became centers of education, leadership, and resistance. Black newspapers spread abolitionist ideas. Escaped slaves like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, they emerged as powerful national voices demanding immediate emancipation. The contradiction at the heart of America had become impossible to ignore by this time, by the mid-century mark of the 19th century. The nation that proclaimed liberty depended economically upon human bondage. The people most excluded from America's promises became some of its strongest advocates for fulfilling them. By 1860, political compromises they were just failing now. The struggle over slavery dominated every national election, every territorial dispute, and nearly every major political debate. So this institution that many founders believed would quietly fade away, by 1860 it stood stronger than ever. But it also was about to face its greatest challenge. Black Americans had spent generations preserving hope through unimaginable hardship. Their labor had helped build the United States. Their military service helped defend it. Their demands for justice had forced Americans to confront the gap between their ideals and their actions. Now the Civil War would determine whether that contradiction could finally be resolved. And that's where we're going to head next, in the next episode. In fact, in the next 5 to 6 episodes, we're going to dive into the story of the Civil War. I've really been looking forward to this section, to this part of this podcast series. The next episode will drop next week, I think on Tuesday. For now, I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History, where we help believers make sense of the chaotic world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that made these times. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll be back with our next episode in this series very soon.